We're open to questions at this point, so please, as we mentioned before, come to the mic and please introduce yourself. Oh, we are inviting Christina up for the panel discussion as well. Sorry.
Oh, question?
She can have my seat. Please.
Brent Kobelish with Cargill. Thank you so much for your talks. This question might sound like shooting the messenger, so I just want to preempt that. Heard all the discussions, great talks. It's an area that I'm not heavily involved in with the sustainability, et cetera. But none of the talks discussed in the data quality of life impact. I eat a lot of meat, okay, and I'm not willing to give that up, I'm just saying, as well as sugar, these types of things. But that's almost a qualitative impact. I don't know how you measure that, but at some point I would think that that would have to go into the impact of quality of life, because frankly, I'm not going to start grilling crickets on my grill and stuff like this. You know what I mean? It would impact quality of life. I think there's a lot of people who have, diets that are rich in, agriculturally, processed meats, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm just wondering if there's, I am not an economist. I am not, I'm a toxicologist. So just wondering if there's any role of that in analyzing the data and how you would incorporate, if going out and asking consumer preferences and how this would impact their choices or whatnot. So thanks.
Who would like to take a stab at it?
Oh, thanks, David. So it's a great question, and in any situation historically, when you start seeing novel products, whether they're technologies or whether they're consumer products or processing technologies and whatnot, there's always the adoption curve, right? There's early adopters, there's the later adopters, then there's people that never adopt. And we see this in almost all aspects of human experience, whether it's people who are told, like in Alaska, there's a tsunami coming today. There will be some people who ignore those warnings and stay in their homes regardless of what happens. And similarly with food, we have had many dietary transitions over human history, and there are people who find these harder changes to make, and are people that find them trivial to make. And from a population level, what I think the role of informed policy is to create a set of incentives that creates, captures a series of costs and whatnot, so that when consumers are making decisions, they're making informed decisions based on full cost accounting. And then there will be a percentage of the population, maybe such as yourself, who say this, for taste reasons, speaking specifically of food, but we could try to grab other things, but for taste reasons or cultural reasons or habit or whatever, these new set of options are simply not worth it for me. I'm not going to change. That's fine. What we're trying to work at is the population level, because for every one of the people who refuse to adopt a new technology or a new process, there are people who will adopt instantly and seamlessly. And over time, what we're trying to do is nudge the population level. So that's sort of a way of answering your question, but I think what we need to be addressing is this adoption curve and the spectrum of adoption, and that's a well-established part of the policy and the psychological behavior literature.
Sure, son.
Yeah, we hear a lot about the importance of moving to a plant-based diet. Are there unintended consequences of moving towards these types of diets, especially from a health perspective? And then also, a question for Lucy, that in your index, when you measure, index of meeting the goals, do those index also measure unintended consequences?
I'll just lead off on that. And it's a two-part question. The first part I heard was about diet and what diet are we promoting. Certainly in our study and in our thinking about the topic, we are trying to be agnostic in terms of what is the right diet, but rather think about on a global basis, there are many people who don't even have access to a diverse diet. So it's really dietary diversity that's at the root of what we're looking at. I know I talked a lot about the Mediterranean diet. That was sort of our shock to the system this year. What's up with that? What the countries who are producing the food that underpins the Mediterranean diet, what's up with them? So we did focus a lot on that. But we try to be agnostic in terms of what's the right thing to eat, but rather look at, for example, in sub-Saharan Africa, people have very limited access to certain parts of what we have come to understand as being a complete diet. So that's our first question. And then, I'm sorry, the second bit of your question. Unintended consequences. Yeah, I mean, what we're trying to measure in our work, and I think what we've all been talking about this morning, is change. So we realize that when you're looking at a system and trying to understand change and advocating for that change, there will be unintended consequences. So to the extent possible, we're just, I think, trying to focus on addressing the central phenomenon that we're seeing in the world today, which is the demand for sustainably produced goods outstripping the supply of it, and how do we match that up, knowing that at a system level, this can lead to unintended consequences. I don't know if others have
additional comments.
Thank you. Christina.
Yeah, thank you. That's a very good question. And in fact, the UNEP has a group called the TIP, which is looking into the economy of the impact on ecosystems and biodiversity. And I have been the coordinating author for a chapter on externalities of food systems into social equity, and we have been looking to many unintended consequences. I have been also the contributing author of the same chapter, but for health, okay? So this is coming up, and particularly in the one of social equity, we are seeing many unintended consequences. We have been even playing with your index, and and now with the World Bank, we are trying to find a way of preparing a typology of food systems according these social equity impacts, because there are many unintended effects that you have to keep in mind that may happen. So it's a question, this is starting, it's really interesting. Yeah,
Please.
The question of unintended consequences it's a great question, and there's so much in that. For example, global agricultural subsidies are used around the world, and many of them have a very legitimate purpose that I won't get into, but one huge unintended consequence is it encourages a form of production that depletes natural capital, such as producing in arid areas fruits and vegetables that are exported around the world. And so what's the consequence for aquifers and groundwater when we consume essentially water in other countries based on it? And are we truly understanding and assessing? And fundamental to that is transparency and understanding the impacts. So you get into a great area that we could probably spend a lot of time on.
Yeah, it's funny. I think of the notion of diet diversity intersecting with that, where you clearly can't provide the diversity of food everywhere in the world at all times. So it shifts resources one way or the other. That's Harvey.
Thanks, Mike. Harvey Anderson, University of Toronto. The title of the session here is the interaction between food sustainability and health. None of you talked about health. We have the food system and we have the health system. And you can't talk about within country or across country impacts of the food system without understanding, I think, the health system. Canada is a single payer health system, and our life expectancy is pretty much at the top of life expectancies. Greece has a Mediterranean diet, but a disastrous life expectancy and age-adjusted cardiovascular mortality. So in that very last slide that we saw, life expectancy and these dimensions were stated, but surely you have to integrate the two. Anybody want to comment?
Sure, you raise a very good point, because we know that food systems, are not operating in a vacuum. That it is, your point well taken about the intersection with health systems. In terms of the index, just on a tactical level, we do look at health outcomes for the populations within the countries within the study, as from the perspective of, what are people eating all day and how is that adding up? It's sort of in parallel with the agricultural production, the linkage is there, not as strong as we'd like to see it just as yet, but how the health system operates within this would be a good addition to our study, in a direct way. I guess we're looking at it indirectly in terms of looking at health outcomes for now, but your point well taken.
Just to jump in and add a comment, Harvey, that your question really begs the perspective as to what's the policy solution for this. And the term that comes to mind is a whole of government approach. I'm not sure if that's a term that's used here, but the question in Canada and elsewhere is that health policy is made here, environment policy is made there, trade and economic policy is made somewhere else. And there are some connections, clearly, around the cabinet table of government and in other fora, but we're not systematically linking these agendas and emulating what's actually happening on the planet and within food systems and by companies, which are actually converging these issues. So policy remains in silos to some degree, whereas things are converging. And I think that that changes the way we make policy, I believe, at every level.
Great, thanks.
Teresa Davis from Baylor College of Medicine in Houston, Texas. This question is more for Dr. Fraser. In considering the protein sources in the diet, I think we need to remember that plant sources of protein and animal sources of protein are not equal. For example, animal source foods contains the nice balance of amino acids that we as humans require in the diet. Plant sources do not, as well as many other nutrients are not present in plant foods like B12. So that needs to be considered when we're talking about, where's the protein going to come in our diet? Let's just switch over to plant source foods. And then there's another consideration as far as the use of land, because much of the cattle in the world is raised on land where crops cannot grow. And if you come to Texas, that's very obvious as you travel around the Texas countryside. So land is not just interchangeable for cattle and grazing versus plants, crop growing as well. So I think there are many considerations when we talk about the use of land as well.
Yeah, thanks. You're raising some excellent points. And I'll reiterate something that I said in the middle of my presentation, which is that I'm absolutely not advocating for a cessation of animal agriculture. Animals are an absolutely vital part of sustainable agro-ecosystems, 100%. And you're correct that the grazers of this world, the ungulates in particular, are extremely, ruminant animals are extremely efficient at turning what would otherwise be marginal land, unsuitable for cultivation, into a product that's useful for humanity. So I don't see any reason, I don't see any debate on that point, or even on your point that a piece of beef is not a cup of lentils is not a substitute for a piece of beef from a nutritional and an amino acid perspective. And many of the ways that we produce animal agriculture today on the planet are unsustainable And many people on the planet eat far more sources of protein and far more sources of beef and meat than is for an optimal health. And so we have to be imagining what the alternatives are, especially as we look towards a future with these significant production problems as linked to climate change and supply problems linked with population growth. And so it's not a question of choosing plants or animals, it's finding the right balance and for those. But that does mean that many aspects of modern animal agriculture are going to have to be reimagined, I think.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Michael McBurney, DSM Nutritional Products. Food waste is a big issue, and it's something that we often have some individual control over. I'm unfamiliar with what was the policy change in France that led to such a difference in within a year. Could you enlighten me, please?
Yes, the legislation was specifically around food waste at the sort of market level. That was, a system was developed so that the food, of course, we're now getting into expiration dates and other points along those lines, but there was a demand on the consumer side that food not be wasted at the grocery level, and the response was to mitigate that waste. So that was the impact there. But a number of countries are introducing that sort of legislation, and as you point out, that is the key thing. It's an individual and a household issue. That's the harder piece to address, but at least we're seeing some progress being made at the grocery level.
Yeah, please.
Sorry, Michael, I'll jump in there really quickly. I think a little bit of background is useful as well. About a third of the world's food is wasted. In the global south, the developing world, most of that food waste happens at the farm level and is linked with inefficient processing and drying and grain facilities. So the scenes in Asia or Africa of rice or millet being dried in open air facilities, just raked onto the ground. In North America and in Europe, most of the food waste happens at a household level and at a retail level. And France's response last year, just to build on Lucy's point, I'm simplifying a complicated piece of legislation, but was essentially to outlaw throwing food that was about to reach its best before dates into landfill and direct that into emergency food aid charities and whatnot. And that seems to have had a dramatic effect. Doesn't solve the problem of why people were hungry in the first place, but it does create a major diversion from grocery store bins into food banks, essentially.
Thanks, Christina.
Yeah, thank you. I mentioned something around these lines yesterday, but I don't know if you may be in the presentation. But in Europe, due to as a part of the circular economy, there is a legislation that has been passed on food waste, in which at least 30% of all the waste has to be recycled and can be converted, either in fertilizers or food for animals, or energy, or or just being reused and refreezed. The point is that 30% of the waste has to be in the circular economy and reuse. Now, some of the challenges and some of the work that now the European Commission is asking to do is to make sure that there are more studies on the best before date, because the best before date has been always very conservative, and we know that food can last for much longer. And second, they are very concerned, since they are the European countries, they have to compare in order to report. They have, now it's like a huge thing is to know how we measure in a harmonized way food waste, because the measurement is just the most complicated thing that they have in order to compare to each other. So I don't know if I hope this helps.
Please.
Good morning, and thank you all for your presentations. They were quite enlightening. I'm a microbiologist. I don't participate in a lot of these activities, but I know that this is something that affects all of us. I'm coming at this really from an industry standpoint. These are all quite lofty. We know we have to do these things. Have you considered, or let me paraphrase, this reminds me of the conversation way back around food safety. And a lot of the same education, exhortation, so on and so forth. The part that I'm concerned about, and I'm wondering if you've considered, is the verification piece. Because customers will push these things down to ingredient suppliers, packaging suppliers, processors, on and on. And the piece about, basing everything on audits, so all of a sudden you've got an audit and another audit and then another audit to verify that you're doing these things. Have you considered maybe a different approach, perhaps an audit occasionally, but have you considered a different approach, maybe using some of the data that's already available on what companies are doing to verify their compliance or their what they're actually doing in their plant and not adding all kinds of cost and inefficiency?
Maybe I could take a first stab at that. Thank you for the question. What I think is fascinating is that in business, often companies complain of regulatory burden by governments. In this case, I think what's happening is that companies, in responding to consumer and I guess investor and other pressure, are creating, in a sense, a non-regulatory burden through their supply chains to comply with all sorts of standards and audits from the farm level right through to the retail shelf. So one can argue whether that's cost effective or not, but what companies are doing is they're actually responding to the marketplace and the demands being placed from all the quarters as you saw. Is there a more efficient way of doing it? Is there a cost saving? Not sure. I think there's probably ways they're trying to do so. The interesting part about this, I think, is that the companies may be reluctant or can't pass that through to the consumer in this current marketplace, which gets to that issue about how do we value the use of our resources. The competitiveness and the dynamic is preventing us from, for example, if you had your orange this morning or banana, are you willing to pay another 55 cents to accommodate for the water depletion used in that orange coming to your plate? And so many of us, and particularly at the low income level or vulnerable population level, I just can't do that yet. So the system is, I think, in flux, and I think it's responding, but it's not neat and tidy, and it's pretty chaotic, but I think there's a lot of change.
My point was really more about the potential myriad of certification bodies and layers of audits that potentially a company would have to undertake. And if that could be folded into some of these principles and recommendation for policy.
Yeah, I mean, you're raising a wonderful point, and the potential regulatory burden and opportunity for an extraordinarily confusing regulatory landscape is very large here. And I think we have to look to some exemplar organizations that have developed fairly streamlined systems of auditing and accounting, the ISO series and whatnot. Fair Trade Labeling Organization, some of the organic standards, Forest Stewardship Council. I'm just listing off a few of the major players in the regulatory auditing space, and I think the food industry is moving towards a situation where we're going to see over the next 10 years a lot of confusion and multiple regulatory agencies competing for space, and then there will be a coalescence. And for instance, we had a talk yesterday about biosecurity that referenced blockchain. I think some of these technologies like blockchain are going to become sort of part of the interstitial tissue that are backed up with third-party auditing, and over the next 15 years, we'll see, like I said, confusion and coalescence on this one. That's my prediction, anyways.
Please.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, it's a really interesting question, and I wanted to highlight that I have been working recently, I don't know if you are familiar with the FAO SAFA. The SAFA is a sustainability program that is for corporate groups, for corporations, in which they go they go point by point through many aspects that we have been discussing today here, all the externalities, from related to social equity, related to everything is, they have a different definition of sustainability, which is broader and includes social equity. And it's a program. It's a program that you can use, your corporation can use to assess where you are. And it's, if you pass that, I think that even they have people that can help you to skip the certification program because you have passed and you know where are you. Takes a while to learn the program, but it's really good. I have been looking the indicators, and it's extremely thorough. You can see all the externalities that you may think, from child labor or slavery or, ethics. It is incredible. So, it helps you to know as a corporation where you are at.
Fergus Clydesdale, the University of Massachusetts Amherst, and being originally from Canada, I have some residual nationalism and pride coming out with the wonderful work you're doing, so thank you very much. I had a question about food waste and all the work that's going on in sustainability, of which we're very much interested in. And one of the things we really never very much hear about is the contribution of processing and technology in the food arena to prevent food waste. In Western Massachusetts, we have, someone once told me when I first came to the United States that if the country had been developed from west to east, Massachusetts would have been a national park. So we don't have the kind of land to grow. We can't compete with Iowa. So we do have small farms, though, that grow a lot of organics in the western part of the state. And they've all of a sudden realized that if you use technology to can or to freeze or to dry food, that it actually lasts longer and it doesn't get wasted. And this was a big discovery on their part, because all they had ever heard was that if you canned or processed food, it was bad. And so now we have this government-subsidized processing unit in the western part of the state that's really doing some remarkable things and reducing huge amounts, for our state, huge amounts of waste, because all this organic material, which wasn't bought during the heat of the season, would just be gone. And I don't see the sustainable, it's almost politically incorrect, it seems to me, to work with the food industry to say, listen, we'll help you sell even more food because you'll become more correct. If you show us the new technologies we can use to save food, if you show us the new ways we can better utilize technologies to save water when we process, or we can reduce waste by 200 or 300%. And I just wonder whether the movement is really losing, a really vast opportunity by sort of never mentioning, technologies that can help reduce waste and make food last longer and actually ship it to other parts of the world that need food. So just a comment.
Just a quick comment. I hear you, and I think you raise a very important question. Much of the food waste focus is on, household waste and composting. We all need to be composting, but less on these kind of innovations. And as you say, we are all trying to get away from processed foods. That has taken a negative connotation, but so I appreciate you raising that. And a lot of the work that we've done in the food waste arena, it's just hard to measure in general. In fact, when we started on this endeavor and the FAO heard we were looking to measure food waste, we were actually using their data, but they came to us and said, oh, how are you measuring? And we said, we're using your data. And they sort of threw up their hands and said, great, but we're all struggling, aren't we? So I think just measuring it to begin with is hard, but the point you raised on looking at innovation is a good one, and that should be incorporated into the thinking of metrics now.
If I might just add, it would be really interesting to look at the amount of food waste there would be if we didn't can and freeze and dry food. If that food was not processed, how much food waste would there be? And I think also, I find it a little odd and that we're really concentrating, for instance, in France on waste by taking stuff that ordinary people won't eat and giving it to the poor. I just find that offensive as a way to reduce waste. I think that we should be giving the same kind of food to everybody, and if we did use more technology, I think we could do that.
So I'll just jump in real quick there. There's sort of two schools of thought on how to reduce food waste in Western countries. One is exactly what you're suggesting there, which is that there is a role for technology to extend shelf life. Everything from smart packaging, which monitors monitors food going bad, through to it's different ways of packaging and whatnot. And it can be not very much processing involved. So clamshell containers for lettuce as opposed to loose leaf and stuff like that really does extend shelf life. And there's tremendous progress being made in that area without any question. The other school of thought, though, is that most food waste is driven by the low cost of food in Western economies, and we waste it simply because it's not it doesn't cost us very much. And if that is the driver, I'm not advocating for one of the other of these positions, I'm just laying out the literature. If that is the main driver of food waste in Western economies, then that is not amenable to a technological fix. So there's two broad schools of thought. On your final point, though, about giving food to the poor and the French approach, the French government has come into significant criticism for this very idea that we can address with the presumption that we could address a massive social issue, which is rooted in inequality and a host of social issues, simply by giving garbage to the poor. I'm intentionally presenting that as a polarized expression. That's not my position, but that is majorly, the point you're raising is hotly debated.
And that, I'll leave after one more comment. Would it be possible to develop small technology areas in areas of the world that are underdeveloped? I mean, so that the food that they're producing within those, like we do in Western Massachusetts, we really have very small agricultural production. Would it be possible to use small production units where you could save that food and create and stop waste there and feed more people of their own food so they're not shipping it out?
Okay, thank you. Are there areas in the world where they radiate fruits, like in Latin America? Sometimes, you go there and you say, oh my God, I mean, this is alive forever. So, there are many countries that are still radiating their fruits and vegetables, and that food can last for a long time. I mean, the only thing is that there's other countries that they don't have regulations for, positive regulations for radiation, but I think that that's what probably you are looking for, right?
David, you had a comment?
Just a very quick comment on the canning and preservation. I think there's a lot of activity on small-scale processing across Canada and I think around the world where small processors are taking advantage of those niche opportunities. The big challenge is how do they scale up? And that brings in the grocery access to market issue and economic policy. Not enough time to get into that, but I think there's a lot of interesting activity taking place in that space.
So, Ferg, I just want to build on what you brought up about creating what amounts to incubation centers in parts of the world that have massive post-harvest loss issues. This is a big focus of many of the Feed the Future Innovation Labs from USAID. And just to comment on the fact we've been working with one through Purdue University, the Food Process Innovation Lab, the Sahelian region of Africa, two problems: food losses on their critical grains, and also you have a diversity issue of food and being able to preserve mangoes and other things through that time. What we found is, yes, you can help on the food losses and everything else, but the profound impact that you have by that value addition to create women processor groups that generate an income is actually more transformative for that group than anything on the nutritional side, because they have more time on their hands, they can send their kids to school longer. It's amazing. We're dropping extruders that were designed for Mars into the Sahelian region, Mali, Niger, Senegal, and it's having an impact at the local level there. So there are opportunities for sure.
Yeah. Dave Kitts from UBC. I think I just got scooped. But just to maybe just capstone this, because this is exactly the question I was going to ask, is we should bring in the food engineers into this discussion a little bit more, and because certainly the innovations in non-thermal food processing are tremendous, but one of the issues is, of course, is the cost. I mean, the large-scale food processing certainly does wonders when you can distribute it within a 100-mile radius or package it quickly. But the cost of small food producers or even communities, like you said, these are serious costs and probably aren't too viable. So it would be a great way to see how we could make these new technologies like high-pressure pasteurization, for example, or pulse light, or even electron beam irradiation, more accessible for smaller food processors.
So thanks, Dave. There's a bit of a wicked problem going on here, and I did a study a couple of years ago, and I can pass along the reference if anybody's interested, where we explored the drivers of food loss and food waste and whatnot. And essentially what we discovered was that as soon as a country develops enough of an infrastructure to deal with those post-harvest losses, so they have the better quality storage bins and drying facilities and whatnot, you actually see the consumer waste issue spiking up. And it felt a little bit like a whack-a-mole, where you knock one problem down and another problem pops up. And the total level of food waste remained constant across an economy, although as a country became wealthy enough to deal with the post-harvest issues, they became wealthy enough to waste food at the consumer end. Yeah. And I don't have a solution to this. It's just, it was one of those depressing moments when I looked at the data and thought, oh, shit.
I think we've seen it, yeah. Oh, great, Kathy.
Hi, Kathy Weimer from General Mills. Great session. Really appreciate the speakers and the discussion so far. I have kind of a twofold question, and actually I'd just like to comment on this previous conversation. It wasn't going to be what I was going to talk about, but I do want to mention, for example, there's a group that General Mills and Cargill was instrumental in forming that's called Partners in Food Solutions, that is in sub-Saharan Africa. And the very thing that you're talking about is what that group does. They provide training and equipment to help people within the country that supports the women farmers and all the different farmers to be able to take their crops, get them processed if they need to be packaged, et cetera, and distributed for profit all the way along the food chain. And so to your very point, those people can then send their kids to school, have, reasonable economic improvement over the course of time. So it's really been a kind of an interesting model, and a lot of volunteers that go and help with all of the aspects of it, including all the nutritional side of it. So just wanted to mention that. But my question really was around two things, with the kind of the carrot versus stick concept. And so for the agriculture sector, what is the true reward versus risk of making a shift from, say, traditional agriculture for farmers, if they're in the Midwest or whatever, who are in that traditional mode, to actually make some conversions towards some of these other things? They have to consider a lot of different aspects of their economic risk and viability in order to make such a shift. And all the factors that they have to consider as an individual farmer trying to feed their families, et cetera. So that's one of the questions. And my second question has to do with the measures and the indexes that were talked about relative to scores and evaluating various companies and what they're doing. And as a company that participates, particularly, for example, in the AT&I scoring, it is a piece of you get what you measure, or, whatever you decide you want to measure is going to be what's reflected in the scoring. And so to me, it would be helpful to have more interactions with the folks creating the scores so that there can be maybe a more all-encompassing approach to the scoring. And the reason I say that is in the AT&I in the last go-round, one of the things that's scored is whether or not you have food distribution in parts of the world where there is less food production, such as in Africa. Our business model doesn't put us in food distribution in that part of the world. So we get a downgrade in our score as a result of that. So I think I just want to point that out, that it is what you decide to measure, and the scores reflect that. So for us, it isn't a carrot. I mean, there isn't a carrot there. It's more of a like, oh, well, just because we don't market our products there, we don't get a reasonable score.
Risk, reward, carrot, stick. Which one do you want to start with?
Thank you. Great questions. When I think about how does the agricultural sector move and or convert, as you mentioned, and for the farm sector, they want a market, an access to market, preserve that channel. So if the upstream processor retailer demands or requires a certain certification, they have to swing into play. The frustration for the farmer or producer is that they don't necessarily get a premium for adopting new sustainability practices, which can be very frustrating. Now, there are some value chains that work differently that can share the risk and share the reward, if you will, through the value chain. So there are some of those that exist. And so what the farm sector's been doing is that you get a real frustration and a real conflict within the supply chains because processors are responding to the consumer and others, and producers declare, we're just producing food. Do you know what we have to do to cope with weather and risk and everything else and pests? And now you're asking me for another certification. So there's this incredible tension in the system. I think the solution to it, or the one good avenue to fix that, and what we're seeing are these vast number of sectoral responses. So in Canada, there's a roundtable for sustainable crops, a roundtable for sustainable beef, which is actually a global initiative as well, where people are coming together to try to work it out and make sure that the certifications that are put in place create real value that's shared and the burden is understood, and you have a measured change over time so that you can continue to produce food but comply with the requirements and expectations of the marketplace. So it's imperfect. Everyone's trying to figure it out. But I think getting together versus trying to fight it alone is the only way to do it.
Any other comments? Do you have time for a last question?
Hello, John O'Brien from Nestle Research. Thank you for 3 very, very fascinating presentations. I have 3 comments and questions around the topics of nutrition, number 1, number 2, measures and indicators, and number 3, education. Nutrition, just building on Dr. Davis's point, we can compare dairy and meat potentially in respect of greenhouse gas emissions, but you cannot compare them in terms of nutrition. So we've got to find a way, I think, of getting that balance right. I was in South Africa, at ILSI, South Africa in September, and I was shocked to discover that you've got calcium deficiency in double digits in the townships in South Africa, a problem that can be easily fixed with dairy, but dairy costs money. So poverty then drives people to the cheaper calories, which is going to be grain-based. So good to have your perspective on that. Building on the point that was just made about measurement and validity of measurement, I'm taken by the antibiotic-free chicken example. I guess there's a moral hazard here in that once you make a measurement into an indicator, it ceases to become a good measurement. So again, how do we make sure that the methods of measurement are valid, that they mean something, and you don't conflate marketing with measuring performance. Number 3 then, and this is maybe my most important point. As a toxicologist, food scientist, and technologist, I'm totally with Fergus on his point on using technology better. But it's not all about tech fixes. I wrote a piece for the World Economic Forum a few years back on an experience we had in Nestlé in West Africa. We were rejecting 50% of grains due to mycotoxin contamination. I was a big fan of putting in Bulo-Sortex machines where we could screen out the contaminated seeds and we could keep the rest. A fantastic tech fix. We actually got down to 4% rejection by education alone. And we're missing the point here in education. If we had better education, we wouldn't have to start fixing the best before dates, for instance. We used to teach home economics in schools, in universities. We stopped doing that. We've got to get back to fixing the education system so people understand food, and then we would cure a lot of the problems, and we'd do it very cheaply. Thank you.
Please, comments?
Thank you for the questions and your thoughts. In terms of the indexes, I think probably your, and the point raised earlier, the EIU index looks at countries and what countries are doing, and we certainly have found that the policies, there's the government policy, but there are also programs that are taken up in a country that also have an impact, and those are usually public-private partnerships, and they're usually of the type that we've heard about this morning, women being involved in the coffee chain production and the creation of a fair trade coffee based on women, and that has a community spillover benefit. So we do try to capture those positive steps with our index approach. And I know there are a lot of company level assessments, and there are a number of systems for companies to report what they're doing around this space, and I think we're coming up, it's all good, it's additive, it feels patchwork and imperfect, but I think that's, we just have to keep going forward there. And then in terms of education around food choices and home economics, this is something that we encountered when making the indicators that we did on nutritional challenges. It's one thing to look at the data and then to try to understand the food choices people have every day, what they have access to within their country, but the biggest piece and the biggest area of progress is in education and teaching people what they should eat, why they should eat it, and as a food purchaser and consumer, what is your role, what are the best practices there?
Yeah, thank you. Your question, which is linked with his question, also has to be with the large amount of typologies of food systems that we are producing depending of the focus, okay? Then, for example, what you are saying about nutrition, there is a new typology of food systems that has been proposed by the Global Nutrition Report, which is having in account things that are different. They are having in account, okay, the food system, how is the food system for health, one? How is the food system for nutrition? And how is the food system for sustainability? They were able to count, I think, only water use, pesticide use, and emissions. But it was, it's a start of looking at the food system typology in a different way. When we were looking at the food system in that way, maybe it was not so interesting to move from what is a mixed or rural system into in transition or industrial system. Maybe we are better staying in a mixed agroecology-based system, and maybe we were not so, bad in a rural traditional system. So it depends of from which point, which indicators are you looking at the end of the day. That's one question. In relation to your second question, John, the question about the best before, maybe I did not explain well what I wanted to say. I think that consumers They can just read the best before, but they read it and they throw it. And we work in the food industry for 10,000 years, so we know that that best before is protecting the food industry and the supermarkets, but that best before is much longer. So now, what the European Commission is doing is to have calls for studies that are going to give us the real best before that will protect the industry. It will not produce so much food waste, because you can keep a yogurt close in your home and to be okay for much, much longer than the actual best before that we see now. So they are doing all these studies. They have many calls to reassess the best before. So this is what I wanted to mention before. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. We're running a little late, but we got some.
Thanks for those great questions. Just a quick response to one of them, and that is how do you sort out marketing versus what is a substantive policy issue? And I don't think there's a black and white clean answer to that. I think marketing in many respects can flag underlying consumer issues that are really serious on the one hand, and other times they're just pure marketing. So for example, hormone-free beef or antibiotic-free chicken can respond to a marketing notion that consumers aren't comfortable with how their food is raised or how animals are raised, yet 80% of antibiotics are used in the animal agriculture sector, and of course we know about antimicrobial resistance. So there are big issues that lurk underneath the marketing campaigns in many respects, but perhaps not all.
Any final?
Well, thanks very much for that, John. I'll respond to two of your points. The first about the micronutrient deficiency or the calcium deficiency in South Africa. I mean, to me, what that harkens to is this emerging issue of the double burden, where in the same populations, even in the same families, you see micronutrient deficiency and instances of diabetes and obesity. And if that's not a symptom of, and one of the most tragic ironies of the modern world, I don't know what is. So I just wanted to acknowledge that point. I don't have an answer for it, obviously. I don't think anybody does. I'd like to pick up on your final point as well, John. You talked about as being a toxicologist, you appreciate the technological fixes, and then you concluded with this idea that education is necessary and the human dimensions of these problems are paramount. Again, I'd like to reinforce that point with an anecdote. A good friend of mine at the University of Guelph that works in genetic engineering to improve the genetic ability of corn to uptake nitrogen, and found himself in Nepal in a millet-producing area where yields were very low a few years ago. And he expected to teach farmers how to use better technologies in order to boost yields. And discovered very quickly on his time there that people were using broadcast seeding. They were simply throwing handfuls of seed into the soil. And Manesh very quickly set up some plots where you had evenly spaced seeding on a line, and you could have a 50% increase. Mm-hmm. But the women who did the farming, they were, of course, as he tells the story, very respectful inside to him, but one imagines what they were talking about outside, because, I don't know if you'd know millet seeds, but they're the size of a pinhead. And farming in Nepal involves climbing mountains. And these women were largely single parents with all sorts of other responsibilities. So the idea of getting on your hands and knees and dropping a millet seed in even spaced rows was inefficient for them, was not a solution. But they workshopped it. So it wasn't just education, it was a two-way co-development of a product. And they developed 2 sticks and a string to keep Mark aligned in the soil, and a rudimentary planter, just a waist-high straw with a cup was its first generation, so you could drop a seed in without stooping. And there you had the appropriate technology for the social context, and it was co-developed. And for me, that's the parable that I think we need to be carrying forward in our minds when we think about the role of technology.
Well, I just would like to thank our speakers and panelists here, and of course the great questions for the audience.